Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and viewers. I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well. Thanks, Will.
Good. And this week we're joined with Aaron Hoover. Aaron's calling is to redeem families, multiply leaders, and shepherd people by living authentically and showing God's faithfulness. He's an advocate for people struggling with mental illness, especially those in the church who may be suffering in silence. Aaron has lived with clinical anxiety, depression, and OCD for more than 2 decades and has seen God's faithfulness in the midst of the pain. He's compelled to speak up and read about this issue in his new book, Anxiety, Depression, and Jesus, Finding Hope in All Things. So welcome to the show, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited to talk with you guys.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting. Like so for those that aren't watching the YouTube video, Aaron is a white male. If you don't know, I am a Asian Black male. And Aaron and I are related somehow, kind of through happenstance. So like I'm gonna kind of give my side on how we came to know each other, and maybe you can kind of fill in some of the blanks. So my sister-in-law, Anna Gibson, formerly Anna Shutsky, because I'm married to her sister. She's married to this guy named Micah Gibson. And she posted your book on her Facebook page. And I was looking at it. I was like, oh, this looks really cool. Like, this looks like somebody that would be perfect for us to have on the show. And she proceeded to tell me that you were her husband's brother. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. You guys have different last names, though. Like, he's a Gibson.
Yeah. So there's 6 of us kids from my mom, and the 3 oldest had a father who passed away when they were pretty young. And so she married. Then my dad had 3 more kids. And so I'm number 5 of 6. Micah's number 2 of 6. So we have a good connection because my oldest brother and my youngest brother, they've bookmarked themselves the ends of the family, the first and 6th.
The alpha and the omega.
Micah and I are the middles of the boys. And so, yeah, Anna, I've actually known Anna longer than her and Micah have been married. She was a part of the church that I was a part of, and we played music together, and she's always been a very special person in my life. So
How cool.
You captured it pretty well.
Okay. Who's better on the guitar, you or Micah?
I play drums, so I'm awful on guitar. Vocally and guitar, and probably any other instrument. Micah could probably take me in drums too. So
really, yeah. Like I know this is sort of like inside baseball that nobody really cares about, but if you ever meet my brother-in-law, Micah Gibson, the dude is like a prodigy. It's almost he's one of those people that have like so much talent that you're just like, that's sickening, like you should spread the wealth,
Yeah.
So, yeah. So definitely interested to talk to you about your book. And maybe we'll start off by just, asking like, well, what inspired you to write a book about anxiety and depression?
Yeah, that's a good question. I never had aspirations to write, especially a book. It seemed very daunting. I would look at people who wrote a book or multiple books, and I'm like, man, the work ethic and the time that you'd have to put into that's all pretty incredible. And so never aspired to do that myself. But I've struggled, like you set up a few minutes ago. I've struggled with anxiety, depression, and with clinical OCD for a couple decades. I remember my first panic attack when I was about 11 years old. And I remember just so many times growing up in the church that I didn't have good outlets of people to go to, people who could really care for me, people who would love me despite what I was feeling, people who didn't try to fix me and just like take away the pain and the struggle that I was experiencing. And so I'm a pastor, and about 9 years ago, I joined the staff of the church that I'm at currently. And about 5 years ago, I just was in an absolute pit with my mental health. It was a weekly, if not often daily occurrence where I was just in a pretty dark spot. struggling with illness, anxiety, and OCD, and just a real low kind of state of depression. I just felt it all the time, and it was hard to pick myself up out of it. And I would do what many people I feel like do when they encounter something like that. They try to find something that's gonna help, that's gonna move the needle. It's like, can I just get some hope? Can I get something that's gonna be relatable, or that's gonna tell me I'm gonna be okay, or what can I do? And so I would go to Amazon, or I would go to the bookstore, and I would look up books on anxiety and depression. And I'm not kidding you. It was every single time I picked one up, I would go to the best-selling books. And I remember prior to writing this book, I looked at the top 10 best-selling books on anxiety and depression. And every single one of them had a word like how to overcome, eradicate, eliminate, get over, have victory in. I mean, there were so many like definitive words of like, hey, if you read this book, anxiety and depression will be a thing of the past. And I read every single one of them. I was like, I'm gonna
Yeah.
buy every, but I was so in need of hope. I was so in need of help that I was just like, I'll do anything. And so 21 tips to overcome your anxiety, or how to change your thinking, change your life. It's like all these things that I was like, I'm all in. And so I would do that, and I would close the back cover at the end of the book, and I would just be left with the question of, why is it still lingering for me? It's like, if this is so easy, if it's meant to be so simplified, why am I still struggling?
Yeah.
What is it about me that's so broken, that's so messed up, that's so far gone that I just can't get over this, like every author has instructed me to do? And man, it was really in that period, about 2 years ago, that I was like, the Lord is stirring in me a different narrative. And it's and I'm biased, obviously, because I'm the one who wrote it, but also
Sure.
I'm
Yeah.
feeling a prompting from the Lord that's just like, it's not, the battle in mental illness isn't just like, hey, you can overcome it with the help of Jesus, or with prayer, or with these 10 things. Like, it's going to be a thing of the past. For me, it's really been a story of God's faithfulness through a journey of mental illness. I still struggle. I wrote a book, and the week after it published, I was in a pretty dark pit. I mean, it's like, it's not, the book isn't meant to solve anyone's anxiety or depression, or I hope I'm not overpromising or oversimplifying anything in the conversation. I just want people to know that what the Bible actually says about anxiety and depression is that when you struggle, God is present, God is faithful. And I think what I
Yeah.
heard for so long was that you won't struggle if you believe in God. You won't have these struggles if you turn it over to Him, if you pray, if you're doing what you should be. They'll be a thing of the past. And that's just not what I read in scripture. And it's not what I've seen in my life. And so I want to encourage people with that message of like, it's okay to struggle. It's okay to not be okay. And God can still be present and sovereign and faithful in those circumstances. That's all I want people to know. I'll give the rest of my life to be able to share that with people, because
Yeah.
God's been doing a pretty big work in my life through that.
Man, that's so cool to hear. Aaron, it's pretty amazing. I really resonate with everything you're saying. I've had my own struggles with clinical depression and with anxiety, and some people understand it, some people don't. And it's really hard to explain. It's really hard. It can lead to a lot of shame, when you're not, performing the way that you feel like you should, and you feel like everyone expects you should, but you just don't even feel like you can anymore, and I just think that it's really, I'm really glad you wrote it. I think it's really important, that you write it and that you did, and I'm just wondering, like, what do you feel like your experience with anxiety and depression, how has that shaped your faith? And how did it, and then how did your faith shape and provide a pathway forward for some kind of, if not healing, I'm assuming some healing, but even more just being able to make sense of life and just stay, steady on the path.
Yeah, that's a good question, Josh, and thanks for sharing that you too have struggled. It always is so meaningful when somebody's like me too. I just appreciate it so much in this
Yeah, man.
conversation. Um, how has my struggle with mental illness shaped my faith? I think one of the stigmas I've heard around mental illness is that it's a faith issue, meaning if you have faith, you won't struggle. And I think long gone are the days, hopefully for most people, where we carry that mentality around physical illness. You just don't hear that a ton. If somebody breaks their leg, or if somebody has cancer, or if somebody's going through a physical trial, where it's just like, hey, have faith and that'll be gone. Unfortunately, that was part of the church that Micah and my older siblings really grew up in, a church called Faith Assembly that was all based on like faith healing. But I think even the word faith is it's assuming that there's a struggle. It's like there's a tension here, and so I need to have faith through the tension that I'm experiencing. And so mental illness really has given me a much greater faith from my experience. Has been the times when I maybe haven't been walking closest with the Lord are the times when I feel like I'm set. I don't need anything. I'm feeling good. I'm doing good. I've got everything I need. And it's like, man, that I run a real risk of getting lukewarm and not really paying attention to my faith or my relationship with the Lord. When I've struggled, when I'm in a pit of darkness, or when I'm just feel like even a low grade anxiety, it prompts me to turn to Him, to rely on Him, to trust in Him. His word, the Bible, has been a real refuge for me, and even more so over the last few years as I've struggled mightily with mental illness. You could just see the footnotes in the Bible of like times I've pointed out just other people's struggle and what God says and how God ministers to people who are struggling. It's profound, and it's not something that I was taught growing up. I don't know why. I don't know how that rose to the surface, where we were taught this different idea of faith and what that means. But a passage that really changed my life was in Jeremiah 15. Jeremiah is going through one of the darkest periods you could see of anybody in Scripture. He says, I'm hated everywhere that I go, and I wish I would have died at birth. In another translation, he says, like, cursed is my mother's womb. He wishes he wasn't alive. It's suicidal ideation. It's deep depression, anxiety. He feels hated, all these huge emotions. And when I read that, I legitimately thought, based on my experience of saying very similar things and the things that I heard from people when I would voice that, I legitimately thought God would say, Jeremiah, stop acting like that. Or Jeremiah, how dare you? Or condemn him or strike him down in some way. Like I knew that there would be a punishment that God would have on Jeremiah for saying, I wish I had never been born. I wish I would have died at birth. Those are pretty big feelings. And I thought God would come back in a pretty big way. And God simply says to Jeremiah, Jeremiah, I am always with you. It's like a profound passage of God just reminding Jeremiah of like, no matter how you feel, I'm here. You can't say anything that's going to make me leave you or forsake you or give up on you. And I was like, man, that's how God feels about me when I struggle. So mental illness, to come back to your question, it's like, it has given me so much faith. It's increased my faith. Because I've seen that God is a faithful God who's sovereign over every difficulty. And even when I'm struggling, He's there and He's present, and He's not leaving me. And I think for a while it hurt my faith when I heard people say, oh, that's disappointing to God, or God doesn't want you when you feel those things, or the things that I typically heard where, man, you got to pray more, or at least it's not this, or just so many instances. I mean, there's so many stigmas and so many bad ways that people can handle those conversations. And I try to give as much grace as I can, knowing not everybody's been in my shoes. But what the Bible says, I think, is far different than what I've heard, unfortunately. And fortunately, I'm glad that there's actually some truth there that we can cling to.
That's, it's so interesting. Like your summary of things that were told to you from other people, kind of to I don't know, get yourself back on track. Basically people are just telling you to grow a pair, kind of thing. And we've spoken to many theologians, many Christians on this show. And I think I could say with some level of confidence that Christians are just crazy, and are find like have the unique capacity to say the wrong thing at the wrong time, and mind you, like I'm a believer, but
or the right thing at the wrong time, or the wrong time but the right way and the wrong thing. I don't know.
Yeah,
it all gets very confusing.
Yeah, words. But because I grew up atheist, and I came to faith much later in life. I mean, I'm still, like, I've got more years as an atheist as I do a believer at this point in my life. So like I can attest that, like, it's not surprising to me that folks specifically kind of in the Christian community are very, very judgy. But I'm curious, like, just for you personally, I mean, you mentioned at the top, you recognize that you had some, mental things going on at a very early age. I want to know, like, why did you choose ministry, of all the professions? Because I mean, if I had known you as an 11-year-old, so I used to be a youth pastor too. Like if you were in my youth group and you had a bunch of, mental things going on, the last profession I would probably ever encourage you to join would be ministry, or to become a pastor. So
yeah.
I'd be like, yeah, you can do anything, just don't go into ministry. So what was it that kind of led you down that path?
Yeah, I love that question. Related to mental illness, I've never been asked that, so that's an interesting way to look at it. When I was young, I had a pretty big encounter with God. I feel like it was something that really shaped the trajectory of my life. When I was 8 years old, I was horsing around in the house with my younger brother, and I broke my right femur. At the time, we didn't know it was broken, but I really couldn't put any pressure on it, couldn't walk. I was one of those kids that kind of nursed injuries, or, just tried to do anything to get out of school or get out of doing what I needed to do. And so I don't think my parents believed me for a little while. But within a couple of days, I think they ended up taking me to the hospital and getting some x-rays, and they saw that I broke my right femur, and on my femur was what our primary care doctor—
That's crazy.
Yeah. And the radiologist thought was a tumor. There was some kind of mass sitting on my femur that caused it to break. Cause it wasn't my brother was 4, I was 8. It was like, wasn't this hard contact or anything, but just any contact would have caused it to break. And so through that process, I felt, I was terrified, and I don't remember a panic attack at that time, but I felt every feeling that you could possibly have of fear and just overwhelm. And I hear the word tumor, and I'm like, you don't even know how to process that at 8 years old. I see my mom weeping when she hears the news, and I'm like, and this is big. This is really, really big. And so,
mind you, just and our audience knows, but like my 9-year-old son just had a brain tumor removed about a month ago. So yeah, everything you're saying makes total sense to me.
Yeah. Wow. I'm sorry to hear that. I did not know that, Will. Yeah. And so through that process, I remember my mom just praying so faithfully, and she was just trusting in God so much through that. And it really developed in me this this sense of faith and prayer. And like that's what we do when we're at our wits' end or we don't know what to do. We just surrender and try to, as much as we can, like there's nothing we can do to control that situation. Let's give it over to God and like trust in his faithfulness. Long story short, I mean, it was a process of about 6 months of continuing to go back to the hospital. And they said that what my primary care doctor and initial radiologist thought was a tumor was actually a cyst. The cyst over the course of 6 months just shrank and shrank and shrank. And I never had a procedure done and have never had any issues since
wild.
then. But at 8 years old, I'm confronted with this, like, this idea of faith in a really tangible way of like, what am I going to do when I'm at a crossroads, when I'm struggling, when I'm in trouble? And so I really feel like God gave me a gift of faith at that time. Why I went into ministry then, I felt for years like I wanted to make a difference. God would use and redeem my experiences. And I didn't have a line of sight to, now I'm 35 and I've been a pastor for 9 years. I didn't have that full perspective, obviously, at the time, but I've always felt like God was wiring me in a way to redeem the experiences I've had. My parents were divorced when I was about 11. I've been through a lot of unhealthy situations and relationships, and there's just been a lot of circumstances in my life that when I read Romans 8:28, which says that God will use all things for good, he'll work all things together for good for those who love him. There have been times in my life where I'm like, no, not this. Like, I don't think you could use this. I don't know how you use a tumor, or how you use a divorce, or how you use depression or suicidal ideation. Like, how could you ever use that? And it really was a place of questioning of like, God, does that really mean what you say it means? And how is that going to happen? And I was in disbelief of like, I don't know how. And now I see how. Like, I genuinely see this is how you use it for good. And whether it's a book or just a platform or just one person that comes into my life who's hopeless and I can give them something that God's given me, that's a really redemptive quality that I think God's given me, and a perspective he's given me in my life. And so the why of ministry is really that for me. It's like, mental illness at 11, there was nobody saying go into ministry, and that of the places at that time, that probably wasn't the safest place to be at times, with the stigma and the perspective that people were sharing. But what I think God's shown me is, hey, this is consistent with what I've seen in scripture. I actually have a huge fear of public speaking. I've had a fear of public speaking, which again is like, why would you ever go into ministry? Why would you become a pastor? And what I see in scripture is that God uses people who are unable. He uses people who are weak. He uses people who are, not fully equipped for the task to be able to do it. I resonate a lot with Moses. Moses, when God tells him to go free the Israelites, he has a ton of excuses. The main one being, I'm not good with words. I'm not good with my tongue. And God says, who made your mouth? And, it's like mental illness or speaking or any fear that I have. It's like God very quickly can combat all of those things to just say, hey, do you believe I am who I say I am? Then I'll take care of it. And at the end of the day, I'm not like super comfortable with all of that, but I'm trusting. It's like, okay, you're going to redeem it. You're going to use it. I trust you. And so that's what I want to do. And that's what I feel called to do.
That's so cool, man. It's so cool to hear your call to ministry and how God got a hold of your heart and used your experiences. And I find that all the time, that God uses our experiences. Obviously, I mean, I think that's why he gives it. I think there's a lot we can learn about God from examination, a critical examination of our past, and trying to understand our own selves, and trying to understand how we relate to God, our perspectives on God. I mean, so much of the Bible is narrative, and the narrative is all given for, a reason, a purpose, for a message, a lesson, a principle, and a truth. I mean, I think we can look back in our own life and find those same kinds of things. when thinking about our experiences, that is a process of thinking, and thinking really impacts how we live life, right? I mean,
Hmm.
it's huge. And I know that I know some of the things that you've discussed, like for instance, even in your book, has to do with the interplay between thoughts, feelings, and then behaviors or actions or anything like that. Almost like a little bit like CBT.
Hmm.
And I'm just wondering, like, talk a little bit about that, how you use that, any recommended resources, stuff like that, for when people are struggling, the relationship between their emotions, their thoughts, and then their behaviors and what they can do.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question, Josh. I think there's so many there's so many different ways to slice it, and so many different experiences and people who find one thing more helpful than another. For me, when you're talking about behavioral therapy or any other approach, um, getting alongside somebody who you can trust to help guide you in that is so instrumental. I mean, I went to countless people who I thought were people who loved me, people who had my back, and they did, but they just weren't equipped to be able to help me with especially therapy. So getting to a counselor, getting to a doctor who could really help shape and aid me were huge. One of the things, just to give you a little bit of more of a glimpse into my struggles, is I struggle with illness anxiety. Can be called hypochondria or medical anxiety. Um, but that was my first panic attack was related to that. I've had several others related to that specifically, where just something medically will trigger me. I don't know if it's because of my experience at 8 with a broken leg and what was believed to be a tumor, or if it was something else later in life. But I've just seen this tendency to get kind of spiraled by something medically. And it could just be a sensation or a feeling or a test result or a number of things. One of the things that CBT has taught me, and that therapists and counselors have worked with me on, is calling that what it is, instead of being like, oh, that I can get over that, or I should get over that, or maybe I if I take medicine, like that'll go away. It's like I take an antidepressant, but the illness anxiety or that tendency is still there. And so what do I do with it then? And I think being unashamed and willing to to tell people that, and to be forward, has given me such an opportunity um, to be more relaxed and to be safer in certain environments. Perfect example. Um, I had a blood pressure test done a few years ago at an eye doctor of all places. Like, I had no idea that they did that, but having my blood pressure taken is just a very traumatic experience. That's probably the best way to describe it. I've had panic attacks when I've had my blood pressure taken, and the more anxious you get around when your blood pressure is being taken, the worse it's going to be. And so I've seen some crazy numbers on a blood pressure machine because I'm so worked up and so anxious. And so I've worked with my primary care doctor, and my blood pressure is fine, but it's being sure that I'm limiting where I'm exposed to that, and where that happens and when it happens, so that I can protect my mind and guard myself from some of those spirals. So recently I called the eye doctor, and I needed to get back in and get some glasses. And I was terrified of going in. I'm like, if if I go back in there, they're going to take my blood pressure. I'm going to spiral. And I'm like 10 steps out ahead. I'm like, this is going to be awful. And I'm just like, I'm just going to call them and ask if that's something they can't do. Like, can you guys just not take my blood pressure? I asked it, and they're like, yeah, for sure. We'll just add it in your file. And I just told them I had illness,
Hmm.
anxiety, and like, my primary care doctor is the only one that takes that, and can you guys just not take it? And they're like, yeah, for sure. I called I was having another procedure done, and I called them, and I knew they were going to play a video. I learned that there's like a video that's played before the procedure's done. And when I called in, I'm like, hey, can I see that ahead of time? Because in the moment, I know what my mind will do with that. And yeah, I could spiral, and all those things. And they're like, yeah, we could do that. So it's like, everybody may not be able to accommodate those things. And I understand that. And if so, we just got to take that into consideration. But I've found so much life in just being candid with it and vulnerable, and just like, hey, it might be awkward if I tell somebody I've never met I struggle with illness, anxiety, and they're like, you're a 35-year-old male and you struggle with hypochondria. And it's like, I don't care. Like, I don't want to pass out on your floor, have a panic attack, and like,
Yeah.
put myself in a bad situation. It's like, how can I get out in front of some of that? And so I think there's so many tools and tactics that I've been taught through therapy that I would just encourage people. Everybody's thing is different. Everybody's illness it varies, but undoubtedly there are things that can help move the needle for you. But it takes a posture of just real openness and vulnerability, which sometimes like comes back to bite us. It's like somebody might throw that in your face. I've had that happen with me. Like, somebody might not handle it well, but what I found is it's worth it to just keep putting myself out there, because I know best what I need, and then I can really set myself up best for those interactions and instances.
That's so awesome. I really appreciate you sharing that, because as you were talking, I mean, so as I mentioned, like, my 9-year-old had a tumor removed from his brain, super traumatic to everybody involved. But he's been dealing with medical issues for the past 2 years. I mean, I couldn't tell you how many hospital stays we've had due to this medical condition over the last 2 years. And the tumor was sort of like I don't know, it was like the final straw, because now as a 9-year-old, he's got a lot of trauma. He hasn't necessarily been diagnosed with, like, being a hypochondriac, because he wouldn't even know what that is. But same thing. I mean, like, if we have to take him to physical therapy, it's like his anxiety level just starts to rise, and like in my need, like we have a nurse that comes to our house every week just to take his blood and to change his bandage, because he has a port like in his chest. And it's just like this thing that just comes up in him. And like, we tried all kinds of stuff. We're like, okay, well, we'll give you your hydroxyzine, like an hour before they come over. Okay, that doesn't really work. Okay, like, how about we just play some dog and cat videos for you, while you're sitting there. And oddly enough, that actually works a little bit. But like, he has like legitimate trauma from anything medical. I mean, it could be, we haven't even gotten into, the chemotherapy that he's going to have to undergo for the next 2 years, or the MRI that he has to have every 3 years to make sure that the brain tumor doesn't come up. Like, he doesn't really know any of that yet. And he doesn't listen to this podcast, so he won't. So I don't think I'm spilling anything that I'm not supposed to, but yeah, like it's a real thing. And I'm curious, kind of speaking on mental illness, like, do you think, telling people or being candid about your mental illness is easier kind of in today's environment, given that I think like mental illness is something that more people are becoming aware of, especially like so I'm a veteran, and I was diagnosed with PTSD I don't know how many years ago, and most of my veteran friends also have the same diagnosis. And it just seems like everybody's got some sort of mental illness in some form or capacity. I mean, heck, like the cast from Ted Lasso did a mental health awareness thing at the White House press briefing several weeks ago. So it's something that America is aware of. So I'd love to get your thoughts if you feel, with your condition, it's easier to talk about it, even though it may not always be comfortable.
Yeah, I definitely think so, Will. I mean, if I think back to 20 years ago, being 15 in a youth group in a Christian church context, it was unheard of. I mean, the first time I went to the hospital with a panic attack, I went to the hospital because we didn't have language for it, or nobody around me knew what it was. And so they diagnosed me with being dehydrated.
Man.
but it was a panic attack. And it's like, so certainly, like, now, if that happened, I think we'd have language for it. I love that Ted Lasso himself, like, I'm glad it's a story, so I can say this, that I
Yeah.
love it, but I love that they're representing him as like having panic attacks. It's like, I think that's very helpful to see a male who's struggling, who's open about it. I love that is more public. I think where it still rears its head is around, like, okay, then what? Like, I think medicine still has quite a big stigma around it. There are undoubtedly people who maybe will listen to this or have heard my story who are like, a pastor on an antidepressant. Can those two things coexist? And I'm okay with that, like the discomfort that may be there for some people, but I think we still have a long way to go with medicine, probably with seeing counselors, like really pursuing therapy. I think we still have, again, that's represented by Ted Lasso, and I appreciate that. But I think in general, saying I struggle with my mental health a lot, that from my vantage point, that's much more widely accepted and tolerated now. And even, like, you'll get people who won't say as many things in response of like the stigma related stuff. I think it's once we dive a layer or two deeper that you still get some resistance. What I've seen personally is, like, especially in the church, at times this still comes up where somebody thinks that somebody who's struggling with depression should be disqualified, or just they're not fit to be in ministry or to be a pastor. I saw that a few years ago. There was a guy, his name was Jared Wilson. He was a pastor out on the West Coast. He had 2 young boys, a wife, and he struggled with mental health and suicidal ideation and depression. He died by suicide in, I think, the fall of 2019. And shortly after, there was a prominent figure in the church who came out and said, why are churches, I'll never forget this line. He said, why are churches placing men who are so candid about their brokenness in positions of leadership? And I read that line and I'm like, brokenness disqualifies us from leading? Like that, but that still exists. And I have a whole, like, excerpt in the book from another big prominent leader in the church who talks about it in just a very dismissive way. And so I think it still exists in pockets. I think the whole notion that we can't be broken, hopefully isn't widespread, but I do think there's just some of that rears its head, that it's like, have you read scripture? Like, the qualification for people to lead is brokenness. Paul says, I boast in my weaknesses because that's when the Lord is strong. It's like, we should be boasting in our brokenness. We should be admitting and open about it, so that that's where God works. And it happens time and time again with leaders in the Bible. They're candid about their brokenness, and God shows up in that gap. So I think we got more room to grow, but certainly has gotten better over the last couple of decades, and I'm very thankful for that.
Yeah, so this is probably going to be my one and only time I'm actually going to say something nice about Josh on the podcast. But what I appreciate about Josh's ministry. So for those that don't know, because Josh doesn't really talk a lot about his ministry on the pod, but Josh is running a series of home churches. So we don't meet in sort of a brick and mortar. It's like we actually meet at his house and other people, and sometimes my house or whatever. And it's a pretty tight knit community. And as a result, like, everybody in the group feels safe to just be open about where they are in life, and that also includes Josh. And Josh has been pretty open about some of the things that he struggled with. And, and I think for a congregant, or an attendee of his church, that's got to be kind of weird, because you're like, wait a minute, like, I thought a pastor is supposed to, be walking on clouds, and have, like, God, on his bat phone and all this other kind of stuff. But like, it's almost like humbling, because when you hear your pastor talk about things that are a reality to the rest of the world, and they're going through it, you know, I think you have an easier time connecting with the messenger, because you're like, oh yeah, like, so yeah, me too, like, I also struggle with white supremacy. That was supposed to be a dig at you, Josh, but but
You're such a jerk.
but real talk though, like if you are struggling with depression and you're the head of a church, like, you would probably be able to be more relatable to other folks and walk alongside of them, because like what that travel, like you're gonna understand like what they're going through, essentially. So I'm discouraged by what you just said about these pastors from these other churches, but again, it's not surprising. So
Yeah, and it's not universal. Like there are so many good examples too. And our lead pastor at the church that I serve at, he's been open about struggles that he's had, especially over the last few years with mental illness. And those are the sermons that get so much traction with people from our congregation, because like you just said, it's like, if you can see that you've traveled this path, and I put myself back in the shoes of when I was struggling at listening to other people, the people that I connected with so much were the people who could identify with me. And that was a real felt need that I had. I was lacking identification from other people. I felt like at times I was the only one going through this. I was the only pastor going through this.
Right.
I was the only husband or father who could struggle with suicidal ideation. I'm like, what's wrong with me that this is happening to me? When I heard somebody else say, hey, I struggle too, that as a game changer. I mean, there's so much life and hope and just like being in it together. Otherwise you feel so isolated and so alone. So yeah, I agree with all that, Will.
Yeah, that's so good. It's funny because you hear a lot about, like, as a pastor and dealing with mental illness and stuff like that, you hear a lot about like substance abuse, things like that, people in recovery. I've experienced things like that. So my question is that, sorry, I had to just tell my son to stop talking to me, and I had to unmute it. All right, to
we
mute
get
it.
it.
So yeah, totally. But one of the concepts they bring is that when you have something that is how do I put this? Like, when you have that what creates addiction is isolation. So much of what feeds addiction is isolation, and what feeds the mental health issues is isolation, not being known, not being understood. And then even you just kind of self implode on yourself. And you have to, when you take it away, you have to bring something else in there, right? So how do if we get rid of isolation, then we have to fill it with something else. We have to fill it with community. We have to fill it with transparency and things like that. And it's like, one of the things though that you experience, I think, in addiction and in even recovery, is you experience this sense of ingratitude at times because of the struggle, and mental illness, ingratitude, a lot of anger at God, a lot of ingratitude, a lot of bitterness, even, and doubt. But we have to remove that, but we got to replace it with something, right? We got to replace it with gratitude and thankfulness, those kind of things. Talk to us about how the role that gratitude and thankfulness play in the struggle with depression. I would put mental illness. I would have put addiction right there in there.
Yeah.
Addiction is a mental illness. And so I would put all that right in there. So the question then becomes, how do we work with gratitude in these situations?
Yeah. Yeah. First thing that comes to mind is the passage from Philippians 4. Philippians 4, 6, and 7 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, through prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God, and he'll give you peace that surpasses understanding." So a summarized version. Paul adds in with thanksgiving. And I think that's what you're touching on, Josh, is like this posture of somehow making your requests known to God, pleading with God while being grateful. And that's a very foreign concept. And it ties in a little bit to what I was sharing earlier around Romans 8:28 and how God uses all things for good. It's like my prayer life changed when I started to go to the Lord with requests of healing and God to ease this burden, take this away from me. I mean, I was pleading with him to remove the depression, remove the anxiety.
Yes.
And
I've been there, done that, dude.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Yeah. And it was subtle, but when I started adding in, God, thank you for this. Thank you for even the burdens that you've given me. There were times I said it probably out of discipline and I didn't even mean it, but I just started to work in like, God, I am grateful because I know you're going to use it. I am grateful for my past, for what you've given me, for what you've shown me, because I trust you and I know you're going to use it. And I think it's been a subtle change in my life where I'm trying to lead with gratitude. Every night when I pray with my boys, I try to model leading with thanking God, because despite the struggles, despite the difficulties that we all have, and my boys have struggles just like I do, it's so much, it's so life-giving. It's so peaceful just to recognize like, God, I'm still grateful for this life. I'm grateful for another day. It was a hard day, but I'm grateful for what you've given us. And I ask your protection and your peace that surpasses understanding. And when you experience that, when you experience peace that surpasses understanding, it's kind of like, it's one of the proofs of Christianity to me. It's not a proof that I can just transfer to somebody who doesn't believe and they'll instantly believe, but it's just one of the markers of Christianity that I've experienced. That's like, it truly does surpass understanding. When you are in such a dark spot and God provides you with peace that you had no line of sight to, and it was impossible to get there. It's like, oh, that's exactly.
And it's not the absence of pain,
right?
It's not the absence of pain.
Sure. Yeah. And it's remarkable. Yeah. And it truly does surpass understanding. And so, gratitude plays a huge role in all that.
Yeah. And I just wanted to interject this one thing. I think that people like I think we often see, right, God's blessings in terms of material wealth. And I totally understand that, material things, and they are part of God's blessing. But I think one thing that we miss is that the gospel, right, focuses so much inwardly in the sense of transforming our hearts. And so the blessings that we get that are most spoken of in the New Testament are not gold and silver and buildings and, servants, and you get all these different things. And in the Old Testament, that wasn't a white supremacist thing, Will. So stop thinking those things.
Says you.
That's Solomon in the Old Testament. But when you get into the New Testament, though, right, what happens is you move from all those things to, what does Paul pray for? I pray that you would know Christ more than you have before. I pray that you would experience the outpouring of his blessing, of his love, that you would experience his love that transcends understanding. Like he asks for thankfulness and peace and to be full of spiritual wisdom and gifts. Like it's just so different. And I think that we miss this unbelievable gift and opportunity we have to tap into those heavenly resources to help us with these, earthly emotions and this turmoil inside and all that. So just wanted to interject that. I think gratitude is a spiritual exercise. I think you're bringing in opening up yourself to the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Aaron, I'm curious on, so this will be our last question, but what do you hope readers will take away from your book? And, maybe furthermore, like how do you believe it can help promote greater understanding and empathy for those that might be experiencing mental health challenges.
Yeah, I really hope, above anything else, that people who read the book, and especially people who are suffering and suffering in silence, know that they are loved, they are not crazy, they're certainly not alone. Um, but I want people, even like the subtitle says, finding hope in all things. I want people to have hope that God loves them. He's for them. He's not forsaken them. He's not forgotten about them. He's not asking them to clean themselves up or figure it all out before he'll come in and help or interject. He's right with them. He's right with us. And yeah, I think that's, if nothing else, like, I want people to know that you're not alone. You're not crazy. God's with you and he loves you and he's for you. And that would have been, if I had somebody tell me that 20 years ago or 10 years ago, it would have been very impactful. And so I'm trying to rewind and go back to what was lacking and what was missing. And those are just a few statements that could be easily summarized, and somebody could even see on the back of the book before they open the book. I think by opening it, by reading it, hopefully people see some personal stories of how God's shown up in my life. Hopefully they get some encouragement to get out of isolation, to seek community, to take some risks in this conversation, knowing there are going to be people who receive it poorly, who don't respond well. I just want to encourage people, no matter where they're at in the journey, whether they've never told anybody or they've told people and they've been burned by what they've shared, or they've had it thrown in their face. Or if they're a caretaker. My wife writes a few sections or a few questions in one of the chapters of like how to care for somebody who's struggling. My primary care doctor, I interview him in it just to get his perspective on like the tension between faith and mental illness, and like medicine and faith, and how we navigate that. So I think there's a little bit of a variety of things. I don't want to oversimplify it with just, you're not alone, you're not crazy. But I do think that's the overarching message that I want people to hear, especially Christians who have been hurt by the church, who have heard something different. I want to point them back to what the Bible really has to say about this topic, because I think it's been, in my life, it had been misrepresented for a long time. And I think God's saying something really profound in it.
Yeah. Just quick idea. You can run with this if you want. But you should think about making a children's book based off of your book with pictures and stuff. Cause like,
that's a great idea.
Like kids experience mental health issues, just like you had said, when you're 8 and my son who's 9, and it's just like, I can't necessarily just pick up any book and give it to him, because 1, he hates to read, and 2, it's like he would really understand it. So, feel free to run with that. You don't need to pay me any sort of like, whatever the compensation or whatever. But how I guess like how can people get a hold of your book, learn more about your journey and whatnot?
Yeah, the website is aaronhooverwrites.com. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, a few different platforms.
Tiki-taki.
On Instagram, the handle's Hoover here. But yeah, the website's the probably the quickest way to get any of that information. The book's available at Barnes and Noble and on Amazon, and several other online retailers. So
awesome. No, that's really cool. Well, thank you so much, Aaron, for spending some time with us, telling your story, letting our audience know about your book. We here at Faithful Politics, are very sympathetic to folks with mental health because, well, like both of the hosts of Faithful Politics have their own mental health challenges. So, thank you so much for everything.
Yeah.
And for our audience, we will see you all next week. And take care. All right.